Okay, so those three videos from the Mouthworks and Soundworks series were all made just on the cusp of Stuart Marshall moving into video from sound-based performance work that were usually taking the form of text-based instruction scores. And I guess this shift is something we'll come to quite soon. But first of all, by way of introduction, perhaps, Conal, if you'd like to talk about how you first came to Marshall's work and also this wider project that you're working on at the moment. And then, David, what your background with Stuart Marshall is.
Just to thank Wysing and Irene from Electra for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am a London-based artist. I'm queer. I've been living in London for a few years, but prior to that, prior to 2011, I was living in Scotland. And it was while I was living in Glasgow, I received funding to make a new piece of work. And I travelled to London to the Lux Collection to research gay and lesbian video in the Lux Collection. I'd read about Stuart Marshall's work. I was particularly interested in seeing his work. I had never seen any of his work before, but I understood that he was very important in the canon of British video art as such, particularly early British video art. And he was also important in understanding particularly gay and lesbian subject matter in the 80s and early 90s in British video. Then in 2013, beginning some research for a master's, which I'm currently in the process of undertaking. I travelled to the Film and Video Study Collection at Central St Martin's, where they hold Stuart Marshall's papers, and where they also hold reference copies of his works for television, which I'd also read about, but which I'd never had an opportunity to see. And this really, both the papers and the research copies of the television production work really opened out a whole new area for me. So we're talking about a body of work that was made between 1975 and 1984 in the case of the Lux works, and then from I think 1989 to 1995 with the Film and Video Study Collection works. So that'll give you a sense sort of what I was doing and how I came across Stuart's work. But as an artist and as a queer artist, I think for me I was immediately struck by how important this work was, and certainly when I saw the television work, I felt that it was important maybe to take this work to an audience and to maybe start sharing my research with other people who are interested in Marshall.
Where shall I start?
Hornsey?
Shall I start at the beginning? Yeah, well, it was one of those strange coincidences of life. When I left school, I went to Hornsey College of Art to do a foundation course. And we were split into groups, teaching groups, each with a different room. And we were assigned tables. And the table I was assigned to, I was assigned with Stuart and his partner at the time, Jane. And it was an extraordinary thing because probably we were the only three people in that whole year, and there are a lot of students who had an interest in contemporary experimental music. I don't know how they split us up. I mean, maybe it was... I know that Stuart and I were born within a few days of each other. So it may have been our birth dates, or it may have been alphabetical. I'm not sure. But anyway, it was like, you couldn't have made a more perfect choice of people to be sitting opposite each other and having discussions about, what we were interested in. Stuart's inclination was more towards experimental composition. I know particularly Lamont Young, so that post-Fluxus area, my inclination was more towards free jazz, Ornette Coleman and so on. And so at first we had this real learning curve. Stuart was under the impression that jazz was like traditional jazz, you know, Kenny Ball and Acker Bilk. And I put him right on that one. And, you know, I think we began to educate each other. But I think what was also clear was that of all the people in the group, we had the most conviction about the direction in which we were going. And that was a strange coincidence as well, that our kind of intensity was matched, really. And even though we were very different in terms of our respective practices, we maintained a friendship, and we kept an interest in each other's work. Really, I think up until the end of the 1970s. After that, you know, circumstances, whatever, so we sort of drifted very much apart. But I think up until certainly 1978, I organised a festival called Music Context, Festival of Environmental Music, at the London Musicians Collective in Camden Town. And I invited Stuart to give a performance during that festival. And I had followed his work. There are various writings, my responses to his work up until that time. So, for example, the performance that he and some other students of Alvin Lucier gave on Tower Bridge, I forget the year of that, 1975, 6, yeah. And also writing reviews of, well, these works we've seen here. And I would say that we both, we were both trying to detach ourselves from existing categories, I would say, without quite knowing that's what we were doing. So Stuart was moving into this wilderness area that became identified as video art, but I would say was closer to some area of audio culture that was not part of the music scene. And I was doing something similar. So, yeah, there was a strong connection there. So that you know, encapsulation is our connection.
Maybe you could say a bit more about the context in which you found yourselves exploring this audio culture. You made this very compelling comment, something along the lines of that Marshall was one of the sort of overlooked pioneers of early sound art in Britain. So it'd be interesting to hear more about that period. And
could we maybe feed a little chronology into that in terms of what happened after Stuart left Newport, where he studied after Hornsey? He went to study with Alvin Lucier.
In America. In
America, yeah. And maybe if we could have some of the... yeah, I think we need to set it up first. But we have an overhead projector here, which will show you some images from Stuart's scores that he made when he was studying with Alvin Lucier in Wesleyan from 1971 to 72, which will give you a sense of the scores in question. After that, Stuart returned to the UK, and I'm sure you'll be able to fill this out more, but was involved in what we now consider to be a sound art practice or sound art, but we'll talk about that term or these notions of categories. And in 75, 76, he starts to make a movement towards a more sort of continual concern with video, which, as you'll see in some of the scores, has been present in the sound installations that he's been making in 71, 72. But really, after, as you say, after 77, 78, the sound practice seems to fall away for one reason or another. And in that time, he's become very involved with London Video Arts. So something has given in a way, and maybe it's sound art. But yeah,
Well, I
just
think
to fill that out
yeah.
a little bit.
I think it was also a personal thing for him, in terms of his sexuality and in terms of, one thing that really strikes me about these video works is that they're all about something hidden, But there's a very clear influence in the first one, which comes from Steve Reich. The tape pieces particularly come out. And this transition between these two very rich phrases. What is it? Under the table, make no sign. And then what's the other one?
Hidden
Clouds.
in plain sight. No.
Hidden in clouds.
In clouds, no one's the one.
Make no sign.
Yeah, and those two phrases in themselves are extremely. You could, and in a sense, they reflect something about Stuart's personal life, but also they reflect his move towards theory. And I think Stuart always had an interest in theory. So he picked up on the interest in Lacan, for instance, which at that time was only really prevalent in structural film, and Julia Kristeva, and in sound work that was almost unheard of. But it's important to emphasize, I think, that there was no such thing as sound art then. It was, if you worked in that way outside of music, you were really on the edges, because all the pressure was to operate within this known field of experimental music. And I think that's why Stuart gravitated towards Alvin Lucier, because he was the one composer from that experimental scene who was definitely working outside the old ways of, notation and this still very traditional methodology. Alvin was more in the sense of working in experimental science almost. And I think Stuart realized that there was virtually nobody to help us. Those of us who are trying to work with sound in a different way, there was virtually nobody. So, he picked the person who could help him the most, but also I think he picked the person for whom he could apply some of his theoretical thinking. And you find that, for example, in the Studio International piece that Stuart wrote about Alvin Lucier's work. I think you made the point that it's almost more about Stuart than it is about Alvin Lucier.
Yeah, and Nicholas Collins told me, as far as I can recall, that, and I think maybe even you said that you've had that conversation with other people. There's a sense that he was developing a theory which is as much relevant, if not more relevant, to his own developing video practice than it is necessarily Alvin Lucier's composition or sound.
Yeah.
Do you think there was something in the choice to go to the US and the situation of sound and composition in the US over what was happening in the UK? And do you think that the situation in the UK and maybe the opportunities within video and the limits of maybe exploring those forms in the UK meant that this kind of drifting away from sound into video was maybe not surprising? It's probably worth mentioning that after 74, 75, Stuart Marshall went to work in Newcastle Polytechnic, and in 75, as I mentioned, in the early 76, video show happened leading into the formation of London Video Arts. So this sort of put him in communication with lots of other video artists and people teaching in other departments which had dedicated role for video art, perhaps in a way that there maybe wasn't for sound in the UK. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, but there was a very active experimental music scene in the UK, but there were a few people teaching in art schools. Gavin Bryars was teaching in art schools. Michael Nyman was teaching in art schools.
Mm-hmm.
But what had happened with the experimental music scene, or maybe the closest part of it to what Stuart was interested in, which was text instruction scores, was that whole scene had imploded for political reasons.
Mm.
So the circle around Cornelius Cardew, the Scratch Orchestra and so on, had split in the most traumatic way as Scratch members like Keith Rowe and Cornelius Cardew gravitated towards Maoism. And I think the effect of that was huge, really. That very dynamic scene suddenly broke apart in the most fractious and, difficult way.
Mm.
And so there was that would have been the logical place for Stuart to gravitate towards. I mean, he and I used to go to AMM concerts, for example, and AMM was the group that really, really broke apart from this huge battle between the ones who wanted to go towards Maoism and the ones who wanted to carry on as artists. And so I think the fact that Alvin Lucier was teaching at Wesleyan, that there was a place there. But it was a hugely adventurous thing to do. I mean, you just, at the beginning of the 1970s, you didn't just go and study in America. It was kind of
And
unheard
it was a
of.
conversation that he maintained both with the US and Canada throughout his life. Like, he had a lot of connections there.
He kept a connection with Alvin, for example.
Yeah, and in the video world then. I'm interested in asking you maybe to expand a little on this idea of a sense of sort of collectivity in relation to the sort of networks and organisations that Stuart sought out and helped to develop, and in a sense from his earliest days of being a student and your involvement in the Hornsey occupation, then as an artist, a teacher and an activist, how that sense of collectivity permeates his practice.
Well, there are two aspects to that. One was a turn towards collectivism at that time anyway. So you had the Musicians Co-op, the London Filmmakers Co-op, the London Musicians Collective, and in a sense all of those organisations were the foundation to a lot of what exists today. But there was also, as you say, the Hornsey student sit-in, or the student occupation, which was in 1968. And of course, for Stuart and I, that was, for both of us, our first year at art school after leaving school. And it was a life-changing experience for me. It was like a huge adventure to suddenly occupy the college in your first year. I mean, certainly for me, it was an opportunity to discover many things which became very influential later on. I mean, for example, it was in all-night film showings at the Hornsey occupation that I first saw John Latham's films, which, really shaped a lot of what I did afterwards. And also, I think, were very important to this sound art scene that was stumbling into being at that time. But it was a sense of self-determination, self-organisation. I mean, I would say that Stuart and I were both very individualistic human beings, but we both moved towards these networks as a way to, as a new way of thinking about how to develop an art practice in collaboration rather than individually.
I think it's something that resonates with young artists. I've had this conversation about how I think as artists look for alternatives to the art market or commodification for ways to sort of distribute their work, or to think about ways where artists can mutually support one another. I think seeing the sort of transdisciplinarity of Stuart's practice and these sort of worlds that he inhabited and these ways in which he did so much to support so many other artists and to put things in place and to sort of leave a legacy, I think is a very interesting example and a very inspiring example for younger artists in particular.
Well, it makes me think about the current upheavals in the Labour Party. Where people are saying, well, you can't go back 30 years, it's just a waste of time. And people used to say the same thing about collectivism, like it takes 100 people to change a light bulb, so what's the point of that? And of course there is some truth in that, and I was a founder member of the London Musicians Collective, and it was extremely demanding thing to be involved in that. But I do meet a lot of students now who are extremely interested as an alternative to, say, the gallery system and the commodification in that, or the alternative route, which is to just go on this endless journey of study, to PhD level, and then end up teaching other PhD students. And, if you're looking for a kind of crack in that concrete,
that could have been a wonderful Just a Glimpse moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Then there's a lot to discover in that period of collectivism of various kinds and the establishment of networks and so on. But I would stress again that, there were very few people involved at that time. So also, collectivization was a way to create mutual support networks at a time when there was no place for this work.
Well, at a time when culture is under attack still, I think it's good to remember these
absolutely.
things.
Yeah.
I mean, is it nearly time to pause for more, or would you like to maybe open out some of the points David has already made, or open it out to the audience? I mean, I would like to maybe speak more about the sort of material that he was drawing on and its resonance with some of the things we've seen, but I would like to hear from other people as well. I'm sure you've got thousands of questions.
I just ask, did Stuart name McStravick?
I'm the McStravick.
Stuart Marshall, yes.
Stuart, you referred to Stuart. Did he didn't start in sound, did he? I think you mentioned he started in textiles. Did you say textile? Yeah.
Well, we were both art students. We were both the same. We would have been 18, so I think we were both just beginning to experiment in a lot of different media. And the foundation course at Hornsey was based on this Harry Thubron method, which was about intensive looking. Even when you did life drawing, the life model had lines and, dots attached to the body. So it was a very analytical course, and I think that we both thought of ourselves as working in visual media at first, but we both had this interest in experimental music of various kinds. And Stuart, I think, saw the potential of video, which was incredibly new. One of the striking things about watching these videos is the narrowness of content. And, when you think about now, where you have just an extraordinary proliferation of content because of technological accessibility, I remember the next year I went to Watford College of Art, and there was a video camera. And I experimented with it for an afternoon. It was like, well, what do I do with this thing that makes these weird grey images? Stuart probably went through the same process, but he found a way to apply probably what he'd learned from somebody like Steve Reich, this experimental tape composition, to this relatively new medium. And there were very few people making work like this, I think. I mean, you would say Bruce Nauman, maybe.
Bruce Nauman's lip sync is probably the closest thing and the biggest inspiration for the mouth works.
Yeah.
If we saw the sound works, other sound works, still life animation in particular, that references Joan Jonas' vertical roll.
Yeah.
So there's a very direct referencing, which interests me a lot. But maybe before we mention that, I wonder if there's time to maybe just talk a little about how through this period of moving from sound into video, and with this deep concern he had for sort of theoretical and critical matters, Stuart started to develop this idea of a signifying and oppositional practice. The notion of a signifying practice enters into his writing in the article you already mentioned about Alvin Lucier, which uses, as I think you also mentioned, Julia Kristeva, and the idea of semanalysis, this sort of merger of semiotics and psychoanalysis. As you mentioned as well, Stuart was hugely influenced by Lacan and psychoanalytic discourse, and as the 70s continued, particularly feminist psychoanalytic discourse. I mean, this is something I think that we'll continue talking about into the second part, but I think it's maybe useful to address now. To what extent do you think video made or facilitated these discourses and how they were entering into Stuart's work in a way that maybe his sound work, his composition, and the score, maybe in particular, struggled to facilitate?
Yeah, well, I think that's about the difference between the two media. And sound has this intangibility to it, which lends itself less easily to that kind of critical thinking. Whereas video, I think immediately, there's a strong relationship to structural film. So somebody like Michael Snow, you begin from analysis of, you begin almost with theory, and that was the character of that kind of filmmaking at that time, and I'm sure Stuart understood that very quickly, that these ideas that he was moving into very quickly could be articulated much more clearly through that particular medium. So, there's the question of what sound art is. And I made this rather ungainly, ungrammatical statement, about this wretched term, but I think it is a deeply problematic term, and I do find it instructive to go back to that period and, see this inchoate, a way of thinking, a new way of thinking that isn't determined by materials. I mean, actually, that's not right, because it is determined by materials, but only because
lots and lots of sound equipment at the time. If you look at some of
yeah. But it was much more of an open field. I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make. It was an open field in which these new ways of thinking were had that potentiality of being realised.
I think when we had a prior conversation, it's worth mentioning, and lots has come out of this, but Irene and I were speaking this morning about this. We were trying to figure a way of speaking about Stuart's early work, and we were speaking about something that's somehow nebulous but still strong. I don't know if that makes sense to you?
And this, I think, since you were discussing when we met research as practice,
Yeah.
which perhaps is a wider term that might be applied to his colleagues.
I wondered how something perhaps cohered as well, and I'm aware that in 75, 76, with the emergence of London Video Arts, there was well, Stuart Marshall described London Video Arts later on as a pressure group, and there's this sense that video art is a term worth fighting for, which maybe puts it in a different relationship to sound art, if that was already an uncomfortable term for many of the people
It didn't exist then.
in it. Yeah, it didn't exist
exist then.
simply. Yeah.
Nobody talked about sound
So
art.
video art existed as a term and was used in quite a forceful way.
All work in sound was constantly pulled back into experimental music or jazz, which was extremely problematic. But video art became a thing in itself, and maybe it was in a certain sense the most free, because obviously also film, even the most arcane structural film, somehow still had this relationship to Hollywood, you know, in the same way that music had a relationship to entertainment. But video art was seen right from the beginning as an experimental medium.
Maybe bound in the terms of television production to some extent, and the
That's
broadcast
true,
industry,
that's
which
true.
later from 79 becomes one of Marshall's big kind of theoretical concerns, and he's credited for being certainly one of the first British video artists to start to flesh out this arrangement, this sort of theoretical analysis.
No, you're right, that's true. And David Hall had made important pieces that were specifically about watching television in 1970 maybe. So, yeah, when I talk about it as being the most free medium, what I actually mean is it was the least free medium.
Yeah.
Because it related to the most powerful medium of all, which was television. So
Yeah.
I'm totally
And
wrong.
cultural materialism and Raymond Williams' theory played a big role in that. And I think you'll see this legacy when we watch Pedagogue. And I think, jumping way ahead, I think for Marshall and his relevance in the 80s and early 90s, especially during the AIDS crisis, a lot of this thinking really kind of extends into that period and is of big influence, especially in the US. But yeah, I think in a way, just maybe it's good to hang on to this idea of an oppositional and signifying practice, and then maybe we can talk a little about how this relates to feminist performance and how Stuart perhaps came under the influence of feminist performance. Are we ready to watch
Should we have
more
we'll watch more with a brief break
things
first?
with a brief break?
So the do you want to say some words about the next two films?
So as far as I'm aware, we have I think it was Going Through the Motions, followed by Pedagogue. Going Through the Motions is from the Mouthwork series. We saw two Mouthworks works previously, so this is sort of the trio in a way. I think it's 1976. Is that right?
It says in the
it says on the video conveniently. And I can tell you that Pedagogue is from 1988, which takes us into the period that I'm mentioning with regard to Stuart's work of the 80s and early 90s. It's worth mentioning that Pedagogue was made as a response to Section 28, which you may or may not be aware was an amendment to the Local Government Act, which was a very direct attack on gay and lesbian rights in the mid-80s, and was really at the time that it was being tabled, it was seen as a real threat in terms of the prospect of recriminalisation, and to the background of the AIDS crisis and the right-wing attack on what were seen as high-risk groups within the AIDS crisis. The way this manifested in terms of its sort of its most sort of significant implication was the threat of gay and lesbian lifestyles not being sorry, I'm maybe not explaining this right.
It specifically forbade local government, which includes local education authorities, i.e. schools and youth services, to promote unnatural lifestyles
as equal to heterosexual lifestyles,
which you'll see play out in the work.
Sorry, I just. So yeah, if you want to take 2 or 3 minutes, we'll start after that. That was a collaboration with Neil Bartlett. It was a workshop which Stuart Marshall invited Neil Bartlett to give to his students at Newcastle Polytechnic. Would you like to recap, maybe, or is there a certain direction we should go in?
What did anyone have any reflections from watching the films? Videos, I should say.
I had a couple. One is to go back to this clear, I don't like the word influence, but usage, let's say, of these Steve Reich tape pieces come out, and It's Gonna Rain, and just a reminder that, and it seems incredible now, since Steve Reich has become such an anodyne part of the musical establishment, but those pieces and the piece that influenced them by Richard Maxfield were all, in fact, of African American voices, and related very directly to the civil rights struggle and to race riots in America. So there was this political subtext to those pieces at the time, and I'm sure Stuart recognised that, as a potentiality.
I know in the early 90s he expressed a big admiration for the civil rights tradition in the US, especially when he went back to the US to make Over Our Dead Bodies, which is a documentary about ACT UP and the American activist response to the AIDS crisis and its corresponding activist response in the UK. And yeah, he definitely recognised that influence. But I think for me that trajectory is propelled to a certain extent through his interest in feminist discourse. And I think really when Stuart came out in the late 70s, I think he was propelled even further. And his work developed through an understanding and relationship of the sort of gay and lesbian cultural sphere of the 1970s, which obviously with it took this tradition of the civil rights movement in the US. So in a way there's a joining up again, I think, of that tradition and his sort of relationship to those political struggles. But I think maybe, it's important to acknowledge, I think, this necessity in his work from the late 70s, which becomes more urgent again during the period of the AIDS crisis. It's important to acknowledge that Stuart died of an AIDS-related illness. This urgency increased in his work as time went on, to the extent that when you see his final artist video piece, Robert Marshall, which is a piece about seeing a Super 8 film of his father, which he has never seen before. His father died when he was a child, when he was present. It's also a document of his treatment for HIV and alternative medicine for HIV. So, you have this sort of perfect merging of the personal and political, which is obviously very symptomatic of both feminist and gay, lesbian, and later queer practice and activism. I think that's very important to recognise. Is there anything you would like to say on that?
Would he have used the term queer at all? I was wondering this earlier.
Certainly by the time you're in the sort of early 90s. He was involved in the sort of queer video project by the early 90s by virtue of, I think, his earlier theoretical sympathies, which place him in line with a lot of the sort of developing discourse and nascent queer theory, which it has to be acknowledged was coming through a lot of sort of UK channels as well. So a lot of former Gay Liberation Front people, the people involved in Gay Left, were sort of circulating material by Foucault or Ockenghem, the French writer and filmmaker. Into the 80s, then, with the rise of AIDS activism in the US and the reappropriation of the term queer, Stuart's work, especially Bright Eyes and then later Pedagogue, were taken up as a sort of, or these works were taken up as a sort of cause célèbre, especially by US academics like Douglas Crimp, who were squarely within, this sort of re-theorization or reconfiguration of theories, including their own, which sort of became queer theory as we understand it now. So he was using the term at the time, but I think it's also fair to say that he was involved in those sort of contributing theories and discourses through the 70s and 80s into the early 90s.
Mm. And I think he's, there's a personal journey reflected in the what we see and hear in these works, which is maybe another story. But there's also this shift in the 80s, which I find very, very interesting. That in this country, the Thatcher government became more and more established, and the ideology of that was given more and more potential to take root. So the work changed in response to that, and I think that's maybe a general trend. That in new conditions there had to be a different approach. Really. That this kind of. In the last film, the reflection of the moral panic of the time, that people could just be bewitched, by this sorcerer who kind of came down in the mist was very real, I think.
And the subterfuge around that it was an attack on all of the gains made by,
of course,
the various contributing movements that were attacking the Thatcher government.
That's interesting. I guess it, without wanting to be too circuitous, it takes me back to this idea of the inchoate and where that fits in, and these nascent practices.
Well, I think one of the things I feel very conscious of is the way canons develop and the way a discourse hardens over time, for all kinds of reasons, but one of them just to do with scholastic convenience. And I think the people who interest me the most and the practices that interest me the most are those which lie somewhat outside of that process. And, those people suffer because of that. So, going back to the inchoate idea, there are a number of people working with different media, including sound, and the idea of listening practice, which was on nobody's radar at the time. And what their work would be called would be a misrepresentation of what they were actually doing. So I'm thinking, for example, of somebody like Annabel Nicholson, who I think of as being one of the most important sound artists in this country. But not only is she not considered an important sound artist, up until recently she'd been almost entirely forgotten. And in fact, 2 days ago, I mean, I worked with an artist, Mara Yates, from 1971, and she and I worked collaboratively, and I would say that working with her really helped me make this separation from the world of music. But she actually she sent me a piece. I mean, she's living in Crete now, but we still keep in touch. And she sent me a piece that she had made in 1971. And it's called Sound Placement 1. I'll read it to you, if I may. A low hum sounds constantly. There is a slight echo, as though in a small hollow chamber. The wind moans outside. Rustle of leaves now and then. A soft whistled note held a little while and repeated. A single pebble drops in the stillness between the leaves, the wind and the whistle sound. All sounds occur at once. Now, that's the kind of work people do now, right? This is 1971. This is a person who's almost completely forgotten, and her work is totally unknown within the discourse of sound art. And, you know, you have to ask yourself why that is. So, you know, the people who couldn't be tied down, many of them really, really suffered, you know, and are now, I mean, they're only coming back into focus through the efforts of, well, people like yourselves who have, to some extent, rediscovered that work. Yeah.
It's worth just interjecting briefly that Lucy Reynolds, who's
Lucy is
presenting a work later, has worked extensively on Annabelle Nicholson and with Annabelle Nicholson.
Yeah.
We had spoken about the idea, and it was a conversation I had with Fiona Anderson from Edinburgh College of Art recently, about the idea of feminist and queer practice and its simultaneity, so works made in the past few decades and how they can resonate with contemporary audiences and kind of speak across generations in a way that there are continuities. And I think, you know, certainly to me, I don't know to any of you, but seeing Pedagogue or seeing Stuart Marshall's work, for me there are many, many continuities. You know, I feel the work translates very well into a contemporary setting. But I wanted maybe to...
Could I just interject something there? Sorry. I think even in an area like free improvisation, which was generally speaking pretty masculine at that time, regrettably, but there was a feminist essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which I'm sure you both know, which was circulating at that time. And that in itself was very important and very influential because it dealt with what happens when you take away these external structures, you know, which was exactly the case in free improvisation. So even there, you know, these ideas were having an impact.
And was that a text that was influential in free improvisation or influential to certain?
It was
some protagonists only.
Well, yeah, some protagonists only, of course. Yeah, because in a way, I would say there was a strong resistance to women doing anything in a lot of these areas. So yes, it was limited, but I would say some of those protagonists were quite influential.
It's just if people aren't familiar with it, it's a text that describes how even without a sort of formal structure, there's inevitably the formation of elites, if I'm explaining it correctly.
And how people can become excluded from a supposedly collective organisation because, you know, I mean, she makes a fantastic list, doesn't she? You know, because they're not attractive enough, or because they're, you know, all of these reasons why people are kept out of this supposedly free inner circle of collectivism.
I wanted maybe to address something which is sort of partly formal, but also maybe goes back to this notion of how Stuart Marshall worked within feminist performance tradition by that point, I suppose you could say. And it's also partly to do with the conversation Irene and I had this morning, where we talked about seeing this shift from text and sound to, as you see with pedagogue, text and video. And there does seem to be a change here where you see Stuart in the work, like he's often very present in his work, apart from some of the sound installations where obviously it's set up in a certain way. But I just wondered if there was anything that, you know, could be said about that in a way. It seems like he very much takes a different position in those later works. He becomes a director. I wonder if he felt like the urgency of the message in a way required him to take on that role, and to sort of organise these texts which he was drawing on. It's worth mentioning that his work of the late 70s relies a lot on sort of televisual critique, but it's drawing on a wide range of material like Freud, Julia Kristeva, contemporary writer, Susan Brugger, is it? Danish writer. Forgetting the name, sorry, it's just escaped me. Susanna Brugger, is it? Yeah, Susanna Brugger, thank you, yeah. So, you know, this material is kind of entering into his scripts as such, because they very much become scripts, and there are actors, he works with professional actors, you know, for a period the work has this character, but then in 84 with Bright Eyes, he starts to make documentary for Channel 4. Bright Eyes is quite a unique work in a way because of its sort of technicalities and its sort of language, but the work after that you would say is sort of straight documentary. But I think I'm explaining that all by way of sort of getting back to this idea of sort of feminist performance and sound, and Stuart in his own work. Is there something that you think changed in a way, or do you think sound permitted for something, or in other respects it didn't permit for certain things? I mean, in a way this is a question we've already asked in the first part.
I think there's two aspects to it that I understand, and one is about the history of text sound pieces. And there's a very nice explanation of that given by there was a group called Group Ongaku in Tokyo in 1960-61, which included 3 people who went on to become well known in sound: Yasunao Tone, Mieko Shomi, and Takehisa Kosugi. And all 3 of them became well known for working within Fluxus. But the idea in Group Ongaku was that it was a kind of automatism, so a kind of improvisation crossed with surrealist automatism. And Tone said to me that he felt that it didn't go far enough, whereas in Group Ongaku there was a freedom between the individuals in the group. There was still a separation with the audience. And by writing text sound pieces, suddenly anybody could take part. So you didn't have to play an instrument, you didn't have to have any expertise in music, you could participate. And so that became the characteristic of text sound pieces as used in Fluxus and by the Scratch Orchestra with Nature Study Notes, that the intention, or the original intention, was that anybody could take part. So there was that political idea that you went beyond any kind of musical framework to complete opening out. That obviously has its limitations over time. And I think, you know, people like Stuart, who maybe had some relationship to that history,
I think
gradually
so.
realised that it had its limits. You know,
Yeah.
that you could only get so far with that, and you could only make things happen by re-exerting control. And I think the re-exerting control came partly through this political situation in the 80s. That,
No, absolutely, yeah.
you know, in a way,
Well,
the situation was
spectatorship and
desperate.
ambiguity, in a way, are a big theme through the work of the 70s.
Yeah.
Which changes completely in the late 70s when the work becomes more
Yeah.
polemical and there's quite a clear political message.
And in a sense, there was a feeling amongst some of us that you could only cope with new conditions in the 80s by adopting a kind of professionalism again, and by being a kind of director. You know, so my response to that was to move into music journalism, which was maybe a sort of seems a ridiculously futile gesture, but it was a way of thinking about communicating ideas to a much, much bigger audience.
Yeah, because it's important to acknowledge, I think, how small the audiences were for Stuart Marshall's early sound and
Or any of
performance
it's tiny,
work.
tiny.
Yeah, tiny
I
audiences.
mean, a fraction of this size. You know, I mean, for you lot to have come to any of our performances or films or anything would be like a miracle.
Yeah, and then through the work of London Video Arts, then of course, video art gained a wider audience, but nothing like the sizes of audiences that artists then were introduced to with the arrival of Channel 4, which artists like Stuart Marshall find themselves in direct conversation with then. Through a process in the late 70s of lobbying for space for artists, but then a sort of protracted period of negotiation once this was set in place in terms of how this would manifest, especially in terms of issues of independent video or artist video or things with lesbian and gay subject matter. So, I mean, there's a whole other political sort of discussion in terms of what happened there. But yeah, I think, I agree. I think
I mean,
questions of spectatorship and audience are hugely important in terms of the form that these works then acquired, and things like the disappearance of Stuart as a performer in his own work.
I went from being an improvising musician playing to tiny audiences to working on a Channel 4 series for 2 years, you know, a 6-part series, and writing for The Face magazine, you know, and it was an extraordinary kind of flip. But I think you either made that kind of flip or you were totally marginalised. You know, so my friends who stayed in improvised music, they throughout the 80s, they were completely isolated and marginalised. And so it was like a stark choice, really. That's how I see it.
But I think, as you know, in my conversation with Rebecca Dobbs, she made it clear that Stuart sought her out after a point.
Director of Maya Vision.
Rebecca Dobbs is the director of Maya Vision, the production company that Stuart Marshall worked with in the late 80s and early 90s. But at this point he had made Bright Eyes for Channel 4, which was produced for the 11th hour, which was a sort of late night slot for independent independent television and artist video. And I think he was frustrated maybe with either the sort of silence around the sort of the period after the transmission of the work, or maybe just what he saw as the limitations of his own sort of working methods as an artist coming into television. So the first work he made with Maya Vision, having approached Rebecca Dobbs, you can really see a change in the language and the methodology. It becomes much more like an essayistic sort of television documentary, but very much concerned with the history of gay and lesbian activism and overlooked histories, ignored histories, or erased histories of gay and lesbian struggles throughout the 20th century. So there's this sort of shift, I think, in his working methods as well. But Rebecca said, it was really unambiguous. He sought her out and he interviewed her, and he very much kind of set the tone of what he wanted to do in television. But I think that's an interesting conversation, and I think there's various conversations like that. Some of the conversations are about conversations between academia and activism, or in this case, artist video and independent television. And there is a shift, I think, in terms of how these things speak to one another.
Is this a good moment to open out to more questions? If anyone has any thoughts or questions, or
Yeah. Hi. I guess I'm quite interested in the relationship, like, between kind of generations, like, and the process of passing on information and passing on, like, almost histories or something, or concerns, and like the absolute urgency to do that within, like, I guess, a queer family tree or something, like outside of genealogy. And I guess I'm interested in maybe like your position, Conal, like as one of maybe studiousness or something, and whether there's a responsibility to be studious as the generation younger, or whether there's maybe a responsibility to be teacherly in, I guess, maybe within pedagogue or Neil Bartlett presenting that, and maybe what that relationship is, as well.
Do you mean as in for me, or do you mean in terms of the presentation methods of the work itself?
Probably with you, actually.
Right.
Yeah, like as a research focus.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I feel there's a responsibility in a relatively short period of time to try and make the work as accessible as possible if you've never come to it. And maybe that might come across as being teacherly, I don't know. But I just, I think I feel a certain degree of responsibility as well. And, you know, my research has been fairly wide-ranging in terms of understanding Stuart Marshall's work and speaking to lots of different people. So, you know, I think David's is very much to do with his relationship with Stuart and his professional experience and his knowledge, his extensive knowledge of sound and music, something I completely lack. But I think I'm just trying to sort of like bear out some of these ideas and sort of I don't know, trajectories that I have sort of encountered in my research on Marshall. I mean, in terms of generational concerns, do you mean, like, because I mentioned this notion of continuity, do you mean problems where there are sort of discontinuities or whatever, or things that maybe can't be understood unless you were there, sort of ideas? Or
I guess, and maybe building like some kind of history from something that's maybe been rejected, as you said, like an invisible history or something, or in terms of like building that through a community, building that.
Well, I think a lot of these things are based very much on what your experience is of the issues that these works present, and you know, certainly when it comes to pedagogue, you know, I was still at school when Section 28 was still in place, so that was very much something that was real in terms of my education. Or, you know, the mediation of the AIDS crisis was something that I was aware of as a child, even before, you know, I entered my teens. I was aware of this sort of very negative representation of anything other than very normative ideas of sex and sexuality. I think the big thing for me in terms of these works that we've watched today and something like Pedagogue is that as a queer it really sets up this attempt to sort of critique gender, sex and sexuality in its many sort of in many attempted forms and in its many sort of permutations. And I think that's something that comes through this interest in critical theory, but is really sort of re-energised by an engagement with LGBT politics of the late 70s, and how that brings with it the sort of radical politics of, again, lesbian politics of the earlier 70s. And I think that that's something that Stuart Marshall attempts to move with. And, you know, there's this whole kind of conversation through the 70s and 80s and 90s about what constitutes a radical or a liberal, kind of a reformist or a revolutionary agenda, but I think there is an attempt there to sort of re-engage with it. You know, something like Over Our Dead Bodies is a good example because it's speaking to ACT UP and Queer Nation in the US, this sort of coalition of political and art activists in the US, but then speaking to people in the UK, someone like Simon Watney, who was involved in GLF and, you know, is maybe contemporary in terms of age with Stuart Marshall. So, I mean, yeah, I think for me, I think the work still resonates. I think a lot of the issues we're actually still living through, if not under the exact immediate pressure of something like the first wave of the AIDS crisis. There's still things that we can learn, especially from the cultural analysis of that period. And I think a lot of the sort of writing around that time and its sort of trajectory through things like cultural materialism or feminist psychoanalysis, things that I happen to be interested in, are very interesting to take into the present and to think about what we can do with them. I think Stuart's work really demands to be sort of built on as well. There's so much I think that you can do with it. I mean, I shared a show reel that James Richards made recently where he had used some of Stuart's works, including Arcanum, to sort of create this sort of show reel loosely around sort of work that addresses a sort of televisual language of some sort, and he'd used parts of the Love Show, and he'd sort of cut up parts of the Love Show into that. So I mean, artists are doing this. That's the thing I would emphasise, and James Richards has shown Stuart Marshall's work quite a few times. There's a recent exhibition at Cubit, another at the Wellcome Institute. The work is being seen, so I think, you know, it sort of stands to reason to talk about it and to, in the tradition of Lux, to try and find a sort of a historical and critical sort of discussion and means to sort of re-engage these things.
And as if that wasn't complicated enough, I think we all have an uneasy relationship to the archive as well. Yeah, I mean, it's a very troubled relationship that we have to the archive now. So there's that to deal with as well.
But is there not a way of thinking about these works as a collection? Because that's a distinction that I know Sinanova sort of are keen to make, that their works isn't the works that Sinanova hold, and I think Lux is similar in that. It isn't an archive, it's a collection, it's something that's in distribution, and I think the distribution of these works is important, and it's worth considering both how it's happened in the past and how it continues. I mean, what is archived is Stuart Marshall's papers in the Film and Video Study Collection. I would agree with that.
No, when I use the word archive, I mean it in a much broader sense than that.
Oh, no, I get that as well. I get that as well, yeah.
But another question to ask is, what is the work? Because when we watch these works, they're mostly kind of interference.
Yeah, at this point.
They're mostly deterioration.
Yeah.
You know, so someone coming to them for the first time is going to ask the question, how much of this is deliberate? You know, and it's an important question because, I mean, even the idea of synchronization, which is critical to most of these works, there isn't synchronization in them.
Right, like in Pedagogue, which...
well, all of them actually. I mean,
it's less intentional.
The mouth works, when they should be synchronized, they're not synchronized. So that what he's playing with is not really working because of the deterioration of the medium.
Of course, I know that Lux, Lux have a current sort of ambition to restore all of those works. So we are seeing them in integrated form, but they will be restored at some point in the near future.
So it's a bit like listening to, you know, a cylinder recording from 1908 or something, and trying to figure out what's going on.
So you say it's not on purpose, that it's out of sync?
Oh no, some of them are, but I think there's an added unsyncedness,
There's
which
an
is
added
happening through the
unsyncedness,
deterioration
I
of
think,
some
for
of the
instance,
videos.
with Pedagogue, there was moments in that aren't...
Well, all of them.
strictly
There's not a clear sync between voice and lips, so that what he's doing of exploring this idea of out of syncness is confused by that.
Yeah, because I was reading it also in a sense, we were talking about inconsistency or incoherence maybe?
Inchoate.
Incoherence, like of history. So, don't know if I can explain it very well, but you were just talking about over the question that they asked about queer history writing and not building up on coherence or being inconsistent as part of this history.
The incoherence to me is important to any of these histories because any of them were incoherent in the beginning to a large degree. So my belief is that you have to honour that incoherence, you know, that you're dealing with a kind of ancestry of incoherence. And so if you force it into coherence, then you're dishonouring it.
Yeah.
Dishonoring it.
But it would be the same to sync it, no? I would almost do that, but if you would put it in sync.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yes, yeah. You sort of accept the degrading over time as part of the work. Yeah.
Is it worth saying something just about Stuart's sense of humour? Because
I wanted to ask that as well. It's really, his sense of humour is really hard to place. Pedagogue is a really interesting one because it's not scripted by him per se. That's mostly Neil Bartlett writing that, with students who are mostly acting students, I believe. So, you know, when you look at his earlier work and his later work, there is humour in there, but it's just kind of like irony and this sort of subtle disjunction of expectation. So maybe you can speak about his humour a bit more. I think it's the specific nature of his humour is really interesting.
Well, I know in that first year of being at Hornsey, we spent most of the time taking the piss out of the tutors and all the things we were supposed to do. And, you know, that helped us to survive. But, you know, he was a very funny person in exactly the way you describe. You know, there's a lot of irony and he was quite a dry humour, but he was a very funny person. And, you know, I think the only way we could survive this particular course was just to take the piss out of it all the time. Because neither of us really believed in it, and you know, we both knew that it was something we had to get through. But I do, you know, watching the progression of his work, as we've seen here, I do really recognise his humour. You know, through the uncanny experience for me of just hearing his voice again, which I have to say I find quite moving, you know, and quite strange, particularly when it's repeated in this way. But I think there's actually humour in all of the work.
Because there is this discrepancy between watching a work that's incredibly dry. You know, I've spoken to video artists from the generation just after Stuart Marshall that he was teaching at the Royal College and there was a sort of immediate rebellion against what he and his generation were doing. In many ways, they would watch some of the mouthworks and just get incredibly bored and then go and do some sort of proto-MTV thing. So I don't know, how do you relate to that side of his humour? And maybe it wasn't allowed to be funny?
Yeah, I mean, I was saying to David in the break here that there's a really nice interview with Tamara Krikorian, who in the late 70s was really kind of working very closely with Stuart Marshall to the extent that he was helping her to produce her work, like Vanitas, for example, he helped her to make. And she talks about how the critique makes the work. It's a really good interview with her on the Rewind website where she talks about the way in which she was receiving so much support, and they were supporting one another by having sort of the encouraging each other to write, and there was a sort of a necessity to write and to develop a theory around what they were doing, but in a sense this critique and also the things that they were reading was really in the spirit of the times. It was supposed to make the work. And I know that later on, speaking to Nicholas Collins, who I don't know if I mentioned this, if I mentioned this previously, it's probably a bit late to mention, but Nicholas Collins was another student of Alvin Lucia's at Wesleyan, and he appeared in some of Stuart's performances, I think some of the performance documentation work we've seen, and in some of his video works of the late 70s. But he said there was a period in the late 80s where Stuart was visiting him in the States, and he was talking about critical theory, and kind of he had this sort of moment where Nick Collins was so surprised to hear him say, you know, after him being such a stalwart of very sort of theoretical concerns, that, oh, but you know, you can't make art with critical theory. And, you know, it seems to be a little bit of a shift. And again, I think it goes back to what David was saying about a different sense of urgency and a different set of priorities. And I think certainly in terms of the US engagement with AIDS activism and art informed by AIDS activism, it was sort of channeling the tradition of the theatre of the ridiculous and this very different sensibility that came from the US. But I think Neil Bartlett is channeling things like, you know, if I'm correct, you know, he's a big fan of Lily Savage and that convention of drag and, you know, sort of early queer theatre, things that were sort of coming into focus at that time. So you can see all of that tradition as well, which is maybe outside of Stuart Marshall's frame of reference earlier on. But I think I definitely get this sort of notion of sort of doublespeak. So, you know, we were talking about, you know, the reading, going through the motions in relation to pedagogue, because it's almost prescriptive for what then happens in pedagogue. This idea of sort of going through the motions of saying one thing and meaning another. And I think just his set of priorities change when he comes out. I think it's that simple. And maybe he relaxes more into a gay sensibility. I mean, we had this conversation previously where I said, you know, Stuart Marshall and Jane Harrison, his wife, I think were very much living in a sort of gay and lesbian milieu in the late 70s in the mid to late 70s. Jane Harrison was involved with lesbian theatre, and through that experience became friendly with Bruce Bailey, who later appeared in Stuart Marshall's works of the late 70s and early 80s. And, you know, that's how they came into contact with one another. So even before they both came out, and they came out individually and sort of parted ways, like Stuart and Jane sort of parted ways, he was in this sort of gay milieu. But I think, you know, the theoretical concerns and the artistic concerns were maybe just more serious, and it maybe sort of didn't allow the humour to come out in the same way. But I think it's there. I'm not convinced that it's, you know, so repressed.
I think those students who rejected the work, they were probably more intoxicated by the possibilities of, you know, scratch video and MTV and all the rest of it than you know, alienated by any supposed lack of humour. But I think all of this stuff is extremely relevant to current conditions, you know, current discussions about practice-based research.
I think Stuart Marshall's methods of reference and appropriation are so kind of present in the work of the 80s and 90s that I think he's a precedent for those things in so many ways. Like I was speaking to David and Irene about the way in which the sort of the performance aspect of some of the other signed works really reference feminist performance in video, but, you know, on other levels they really appropriate things, and I think that definitely feeds through into the work that you see coming in the 80s. But I mean, even just his notion of quotation and using sort of theoretical texts and getting actors to perform theoretical texts and those sort of issues. I mean, they're really present in everything that comes after. Maybe I wonder if they actually knew the breadth of his work. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just.
No, I'm not saying that there was a complete break with him. I was saying there was the sense that there was a type of work being produced that was dry, and you had to work at to find any humour in. So,
I mean, I'm a huge fan of the work of the 80s and early 90s, and I think that had to happen as well. Like, I think it was just a slightly different set of priorities and different histories. You know, a lot of that work references stuff like Jack Smith or Cocteau or anger or a lot of those things, which undoubtedly fed into MTV culture and sort of, but also had this history of kind of coming into contact with the counterculture in London from the late 60s. So that was already, being disseminated through the Arts Lab and the Film Co-op and places like that. So it wasn't like they discovered that work either. Yeah.
David, you were just saying something about practice and research, and I was really interested in where you were going with that.
Well, as somebody who supervises PhDs, practice-based PhDs, and has a huge amount of trouble with it, a huge amount of trouble in accepting it, and even taking it seriously. I think there is a way of bringing together practice and theory in which you can no longer really unpick the elements, and I think people like Stuart, they illustrate that, or they pioneered that in a sense. But the models that now exist, personally, I don't feel that they really work, because I don't think there's a clear idea of what it actually means. And what's lacking is the capacity to look back at artists like Stuart and see how it was actually done from a position of not having any precedent, really. I mean, I'm not saying there weren't artists in the past who worked in that way, because clearly there were, but it wasn't formulated as an idea. And so, I really struggle with it as somebody who's a supervisor and examiner in that area, and feel completely disillusioned with it. But at the same time, I do feel that, I would say in my own practice, it's very much a bringing together of, writing and making and so on. So I think it can be done. But it's really problematic at the moment. And one of the ways in which it's problematic is that I get to examine a lot of practice-based PhDs, which I'd have to quickly look around the room, which I think are pretty shallow, and I'm making a decision. Somebody should be able to put doctor in front of their name, this ridiculous honorific. So,
but does this point to a bigger question about the role of the arts then? Because something that's really struck me is the importance of Polytechnic in the 70s and radical new art forms coming out of places like Newcastle Poly, or even you talk about going to Watford College of Art and things.
That's right.
At that time,
which was a technical college.
Yeah, those were the places that were driving all of this research and allowing it to happen.
Sure.
And we don't have that anymore in Britain, do we? It's just not even an option to operate like that. If you're running an art school, you're not allowed that freedom to allow practice to emerge like this. So where are these centres? We have to find the centres to do that now.
I would almost say it's more institutionalized now. The idea of having a practice-based PhD, where the kind of work that you're talking about, that just sort of emerged out of like a body of research or body of work just developing over time and finding your own solutions is getting systematized.
Well, as I'm now a university chair, and that in theory gives me the freedom to do what I like. What I've chosen to do is try to work on the different ways in which we communicate with each other, the way in which we exchange ideas. By definition almost, that is to do with a kind of intimacy. And so consequently, I'm under constant pressure to do bigger events. And I say, well, I'm interested in intimacy. I'm not interested in whether we get 500 people. I don't want that, I'm interested in making a kind of format in which we approach these things in a different way. So I think to some degree it does exist, but it's a constant struggle.
I think on that note we might have to
Constant struggle.
draw to a close, optimistically as ever.